The platform and website that instructs me as to what is going on tells me it's showtime and that my stream is live. It's not Memorex, but it is live, and we are commence this evening with episode 6, Journey of an Aesthete podcast. I'm your host, MitchHampton. Episode 6 of my series on, this is kind of a long title. I've had to shorten it because of the character restrictions sometimes. What can I say? Isaiah Berlin, Romanticism and its effects on art and culture. So it's not only about the movement of Romanticism, of course, which comes down to us from the late 18th century into the 19th century, but it's of many effects: arts, letters, culture, popular culture, unpopular culture, music, etc. You can see that for the first time in a long time, I have my TV with us, because we're going to listen to Tom Stoppard lecture. The reason for this, of course, is we lost Tom Stoppard this past couple of weeks, this month. It's really hard for me to speak about Stoppard without speaking about him in a autobiographical manner. That is, my first encounter with his work would have been as a child, as a boy, in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My very first encounter. This is only a 2 or 3 years before I saw two very unusual plays, Jumpers and Travesties. And those were larger productions, and my memory is a little vague of those, about philosophy, about historical figures. Travesties, of course, his title lets you know what he thinks of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and some of the folks in that play. But this is something he would do many, many, many decades later in Arcadia and in Coast of Utopia, using historical personages. But to talk about Stoppard with a degree of, fairness, fair as I can be, is he, in playwriting, theater, is a giant. He's so good. So I'm gonna make superlatives that come. He's one of the greatest. He's so good. He hardly has any peers in the 20th century, in my view. Hardly has any. He's certainly a better playwright than Bertolt Brecht. I think Pinter's a peer of his. He's in that ballpark. And I do, in some ways, say that he shares a lot of affiliation and fellow feeling with Shakespeare because of language and what he does in language, as well as some things about character and theme. So yeah, he's pretty good. So we're going to listen to talk. Now, this is the Copyright Act of 1976. The bicentennial year comes to us to help us. I'm going to play this. This is, anyhow, I didn't finish my story about encountering. I saw a play called The Real Inspector Hound in Pittsburgh. And this guy here, this man in the 70s clothes, was my mother's English teacher in 1959, when he was really, really young. I mean, he must have been like 18 or something. And he lived in Pittsburgh, and one of my trips away from home in the 1970s was to visit, his name was Paul Moshnick, visit him and his live-in boyfriend. Remember, this is the 70s, and I'm a boy, and I'm going to visit my mom's English teacher who was in a relationship with a man in Pittsburgh. And his boyfriend's name was Harry Grant, and I spent a weekend with them. And his boyfriend was an architect, and I went to one show. It was a matinee play, and that show, of course, was The Real Inspector Hound, about which I knew nothing. There was a theater critic in the audience commenting on the play, and already this is a play from the 60s. It has all the humor and the illusions, the references that Stoppard was known for. I mean, Stoppard's career, of course, as he goes on, he gets, in many respects, more emotive, more emotional, more serious, a little heavier in places. Certainly in The Real Thing, certainly, Indian Ink, of course, Hapgood, Night and Day, which is about journalism. So I'm just going to play a little clip of him. Now, this is Tom Stoppard in 2001, 5 months before 9/11. So no one's thinking about September 11th. It has not happened yet. We're in the very beginning. I think it's March of 2001. So just a few months before September. And he has been up all night writing this play about Russians, as he says to his audience. He's at the 92nd Street Y. He's at the 92nd Street Y. Oops. Here we go. This is the problem with these kinds of, All right, just play.
Know about that, but that's.
Okay, got it there. 2001, and he, as he says in this lecture, he was up all night before giving this talk in the very beginning of the 21st century to this audience in New York, up all night writing this play about these Russians, and he doesn't even say the name yet, but he's in the middle of it. So we're seeing a work in progress. We're seeing an artist, basically seeing an artist writing something. Better yet, we're seeing artists talking about this thing he's writing while he's doing it, in the period when he's doing it to an audience. And I don't even think, of course he doesn't have a title. He doesn't, I don't know how much of it has been finished. And so you're going to get, of course, it became known as the Coast of Utopia. And he talks about both Belinsky and Herzen. Herzen is a major figure in Berlin's theory. Alexander Herzen, one of the earliest socialists. In fact, Stoppard and Berlin both claimed that he was the first socialist in Russia, in the first proclaimed one of the earliest people of that political persuasion. His autobiography, My Life and Times, Alexander Herzen, is a must-read. We're going to get to Berlin today, don't worry. We're going to get to some Germans, we get to some people, but I just want to open up our show with a little snippet of the great Tom Stoppard, who I put in the company of Shakespeare and Harold Pinter, so you have me to blame for saying that if you don't agree. But let's hear him talk a little bit.
A large part of
hope it's clear.
What's going on there. Look, this is it pretty much. What happens here is that it's a play which tries to concern itself with different responses to living in a tyranny. At that time, there were people who were revolted by the external world of Tsarist Russia, incapable of dealing with it, unwilling to join with it, and they became literally superfluous to society, and Pushkin was the first person who termed them superfluous men. But there were others who turned inward into German idealistic philosophy, which was relatively new and exciting then, and others studied the French Revolution, so you get the picture.
So I should comment on Stoppard's own comments here a little bit, if you don't mind. So Tom Stoppard was a conservative, a Tory, a small C conservative, which puts him in the 20th century at odds with all of his peers. I mean, if you think about Carol Churchill, Cloud Nine, Top Girls, Joe Orton. I mean, these are politically radical left-wing playwrights in Britain. Stoppard's alone, but he's not if there is such a thing, he's not a bad conservative. So he's an interesting figure, independent. But understand too that he's writing about people who were repulsed by Tsarist Russia. So Tom Stoppard was most strongly anti-communist, partly because of his own experience being from Czech origin, Czechoslovakia, seeing what happened to his country. Even though he grew up in London, England, he's English, knowing that tyranny, but also, make no mistake, Tom Stoppard is every bit as disgusted with Tsarist Russia as the Lenins and the Bakunins and the Herzens were. And so just because because we may not always agree with all of his political views, this great artist, this great playwright, he's gets most of the facts right about evaluation, but set the stage for that.
People who preferred to study the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Hegel was Alexander Herzen, and he was a man of genius. He ended up living in London, where he published a newspaper in Russian, and he died in, I think it's 1870. No, let me think. Yeah. And he set himself with all his might and all his spirit against the idea that we're all the playthings of a single principle, a cosmic force, whether it was the Marxist one, that history is the dialectic as contrived by the class struggle, or the early French socialists, or the Hegelian, who felt that we were all more or less, privileged to be the ants in a great dialectical cosmic spirit, the progress of that. He absolutely rebelled against that. Anyway, that you don't need to know any of that. Here's him.
He says you don't need to know any of that, but he goes on and on about the thing you don't need to know any of that. But yet he makes it a point to let you know biographical details. So Stoppard, his plays are very imaginative and they're fictional. They use real people, but they're dramatic. They're dramatic representations and reconstructions of actual living historical figures. But he does his research, and he knows all about history of Russia, history.
Here he is talking. I'll try and skip through a little bit. Because that's his side of the picture. What is wrong with this picture? You remember those puzzle pictures when we were children? There'd be a drawing with things wrong in it, a clock with no hands, a shadow going the wrong way, the sun and stars out at the same time. And it would say, what is wrong with this picture? Someone sitting next to you in class disappears overnight. Nobody knows anything. In the public gardens, ice creams are eaten in all the usual flavors. What is wrong with this picture? The Kritsky brothers disappeared for insulting the Tsar's portrait, Antonovich and his friends for forming a secret society, meaning they met in somebody's room to read a pamphlet you can buy on the street in Paris. Young men and women are mating like swans on the skating ground. A crocodile of Poles goes clanking by in leg irons on the Vladimir Road. There is something wrong with this picture. Are you listening? You're in the picture. Professor Pavlov, with a twinkle in his eye, has taken to buttonholing us with philosophy. You wish to understand the nature of reality. Ah, but what do we mean by reality? By nature? What do we mean by understand? So, that's philosophy, well. And at Moscow University, teaching it is forbidden as a threat to public order. Professor Pavlov's class is actually physics and agriculture. It's only by centrifugal force that he goes flying off from crop rotation to Schelling's philosophy of nature. But what with Father Ternovsky substituting on female diseases and the professor of gynecology returning the favor on the Immaculate Conception, nobody is the wiser. So that's all right. When Sangurov was being taken to Siberia, he managed to give his escorting officer the slip. But the police got on his track, and when he saw there was no escape, he cut his throat, but not enough. So they tried him again and sent him to the mines, and his property was confiscated. This property consisted of 250 souls in the Bronitsky district of Moscow and 450 souls in Nizhny Novgorod. What is wrong with this picture? Nothing. It's Russia. A landowner's estate is reckoned not in acres but in adult male serfs, and the agent of reform is not the rebellious slave but the repentant master. What a country. Napoleon had to drag us into Europe before our embarrassment at ourselves put seditious thoughts of reform into the heads of the returning army officers, and in the end, their heads into a noose. One day, not long after the Tsar celebrated his coronation by hanging the Decembrists, my father took me and my best friend Nick Agaryov for a drive in the country. I was 14, and until I met Nick, I thought I was the only boy like me in the whole of Russia. At Luzhniki we crossed the river. Nick and I ran on ahead, up to the Sparrow Hills. At the top, you could see all the roofs and cupolas of the city shining in the setting sun. And we suddenly embraced and made a sacred vow to dedicate our lives, yes, sacrificed them, if need be, to avenge the Decembrists. It was the hinge of my life.
Well,
for me, it was reading Schelling's system of transcendental idealism.
so this is Romanticism at its core. He says, what changed my life, this character says, reading Schelling's Transcendental Idealism, one of the great romantics. So it all, Stoppard is most relevant to our series. Couldn't be more relevant.
Almost unforgivable. Thank you.
This is I think that's it. Farewell, Stoppard. We're going to go to other things now, but I just thought it would be interesting. So I did see the original production of The Real Thing on Broadway, the young Jeremy Irons and the young Glenn Close. I think it was 83 or 84, and I mean, these are the experiences I've had, you know. That was the same year I saw Hurley. So that was the year of Hurley Burley. I saw two incredible productions in 1 year. New York theater history, this Jeremy Irons and Glenn Close, Real Thing. And then the Hurley Burley, Mike Nichols with Harvey Keitel, Sigourney Weaver, William Hurt, Jerry Stiller, Cynthia Nixon. Was Judith Ivey in that? Yeah, Judith Ivey. Yeah, William Hurt, Christopher Walken. All on the same production. So that was those are my two 80s. And those are really, you know, those years of seeing those kind of productions. Some of the last years I actually watched regularly New York theater because I really fell out of habit or fell out of practice of seeing New York theater. So I didn't see a lot of the last Stoppards, unfortunately. Living in Boston, I just wasn't able to get to some of his last plays, even though I did know them and would see other productions of them. I would see other productions in other cities of The Hard Problem, for example. Parts of Coast of Utopia. And, of course, Arcadia. So I'm not going to read some of the big greatest hits. I just thought it would be interesting to hear an artist talk about their work. He's just written this the night before, and he's telling you his thoughts about Herzen. So let's go to, as I promised in my unfinished dialogue. So what was the unfinished dialogue? Isaiah Berlin. So when we last left off, of course, we were discussing correspondence and, you know, letter writing and its art. And I really felt coming away from episode 5 that we had not talked about it enough. That I wanted to discuss more And of course, there's this wonderful volume of Berlin, and this is in the 80s and 90s. So this is mid 80s, and Beata Polanowska-Sygulska, Polish. So this is I guess, an undergraduate woman in Poland. And during the communist regime, so this is the mid 80s, understand it's before the wall comes down. She's a fan of Isaiah Berlin. She's writing to Isaiah Berlin at Oxford University in the 80s, and he's writing back. And I just want to, so important, the character of Berlin. I mean, at least this aspect of Berlin, his character could not be more praiseworthy, more commendable. It's the way he treats her in the letters and the way he relates to her is simply extraordinary, which she remarks on, because she's just she's just a lowly student, in Poland, and she says, "Well, Professor Berlin, what do you think about this? I'm trying to write this paper." And he answers her and goes on and on. He's so generous with her and says, "Well, just extraordinary. This whole volume is extraordinary. This young political philosopher." Better yet, they correspond through the fall of the Berlin Wall. So you get to 1990, 91, and they share what just happened, what's going to happen to us in Poland. And the bittersweet ambivalence of both people, because both Berlin and Sygulska are, well, this is great, finally, we can breathe now, Lech Walesa and that struggle for the Poles, but both of them see the money men coming in, and that part is not good, and they're worried, and of course, complicated, right? So I've just set the stage for the times in this. So I'm just going to read a little bit of here. And they also met in person, so they didn't just write, but when they could, they she came to England, UK, and he, all right. I'm going to just start February 1986. This is Berlin responding to one philosophic question. Again, this is an undergrad. This Paul is writing to him, writing to the Berlin here. Exciting. I'm just going to read Berlin's response. February 1996. Dear Mrs. Polanowska-Sygulska. I'm sorry, my Polish is terrible, so bear with me. This is Berlin. Right. Thank you very much for your most interesting letter, which I read with great pleasure and attention, and have since mislaid, although I think I remember its contents well. So again, art of letter writing. He says, your letter is interesting, great pleasure, great attention, but I've mislaid it. I've lost your letter, but I remember his contents well. So he's letting Beata here know that he remembers it. Right? Contents well. Having read it twice, he read this undergraduates or graduate, I don't know. He read her letter twice. Just saying. It may be that my answer will not precisely answer any of your questions. So again, it's self-deprecation I talked about in other episodes in these letter writings. It's not false humility. It's just putting the reader, putting the other interlocutor at ease, and I don't know if I'll do it, but I'll do my best. It's kind of the spirit of good faith. Is he says, I shall do my best. If I find it in the meantime, I shall try to modify this letter accordingly. So he says he's lost her letter in all of his clutter and his papers, I'm sure. But he goes on to say that if I find the letter and I forgot some important things in your letter, I'll revise this letter. Or I'll send you another letter. It's remarkable. If we can bring this back into the world, this kind of, I don't know, just care and attention and letters, and just throw out there as an idea. Now, first then, let me talk about the difficult question of human nature. which he puts in quotes, human nature. Do I believe in a fixed and unalterable human nature? You rightly quote me as saying that I do not. That's quite radical, by the way. So Berlin's on record in this lane saying he doesn't believe in a universal fixed human nature. That puts him in the company of some of his own, I should say, foes, rivals, some of the most radical thinkers, the Jacques Derridas and the Foucaults, who he makes fun of and does a bit, they say similar things. Some of the, the more, it's interesting to hear him say that, but there's always a but, right? So he says, I don't believe in a fixed human nature. And then again, Rodney Quiltney is referring to it as the basis of human communication. So he says, it's not fixed, it's not universal, but it is the very basis of human communication. What then do I believe? I wish I could answer this question with extreme precision, but it does not seem to me to lend itself to that. What I think I believe is that there are thinkers, principally believers in natural law, and he capitalizes natural in law, who propose that all men are created, whether by God or nature, endowed with innate knowledge of certain truths, some factual, some normative. The lists differ from Aristotle, the Stoics, Isidore of Seville, Gratian, Grotius, etc. But for the most part, they include the existence of God, the knowledge of good and evil, right and wrong, the obligation to tell the truth, return debts, keep promises, some or all of the biblical 10 Commandments, and so on. I do not know who first questioned this. I dare say Epicurus or Lucretius. But in modern times, the main attack upon this was delivered by thinkers like Vico, we mentioned him here, Giambattista Vico, and Herder. I've got the Herder book here. Here's Herder. And Marx, of course, and indeed Hegel and his followers, and of course the empiricists, not Locke but Hume, and his followers, according to whom, whatever the status of these natural laws, primitive men did not possess knowledge or even awareness of them, and they came into consciousness, or indeed formed objects of belief or certainty in the course of evolution, or under the influence of changes in material circumstances and the growth of culture, whatever factors enter into that. For this entails that human beings go through a process of moral or metaphysical growth and development, and this is as valid as that empirical knowledge is an onward-going process, whether one believes that it tends to be progressive development towards some kind of perfection, which it may never reach, or not, that it is cumulative but possesses no identifiable structure or teleological tendency. That is, they believe that what is called human nature varies and differs from culture to culture or even within cultures. And so that's pretty much a sense of, but you can see he goes on. This is the letter. He responds to her letter. Look, imagine you got a letter in the mail like this. I'm going to read her follow-up. This is April 1986. It takes some time. February, March, few months, It's slow post, slow mail, right? The 80s. But you can imagine how awestruck she was to receive such a thing, right? Dear Professor Berlin, I do not know how to express my gratitude for the letter you wrote to me. I had never expected you to treat me so seriously as to write a whole treatise. I showed you all those pages. She wrote her whole treatise. Jeez. Just for my use. Even more than ever, I feel obliged to do my best working on your ideas. Please forgive the awful delay in answering your letter. I learned that Dr. Pelczynski from Oxford, who is in charge of the whole scheme of scholarships, was going to visit Krakow during Easter. I made an appointment with him. We met twice, and he was extremely kind to me. As one of the scholars already granted a scholarship happened to drop out of the scheme. Dr. Pelczynski accepted me for 2 months at Oxford, namely July and August 1986. So she's going to Oxford. So she's going to get to meet Isaiah Berlin, of course, right? It's going to Oxford. Everything goes well at my university, as there are some complex passport procedures. I shall be happy to visit England in the summer. I should say I love the UK in the summer. I've been twice. Something special about the summer and the heat even. And that's another discussion. But yeah, visit in summer. I hope that you will be so kind to spare me some of your time during this period. I am very grateful to you for your advice and consideration. Had it not been for these, I would not have been able to get the scholarship. In fact, I had never thought about it seriously. It was just a dream of mine to contact you personally and ask all the questions that I have. Though I shall be terribly embarrassed, I hope that my deep interest in your ideas will help me to express myself. I was happy to find that your letter confirmed some of my intuitions. She goes on to talk about Thomas Aquinas and Heidegger and all the existentialists, and these are quite the letters. So then there's a follow-up letter. He says, well, I won't be there when you come, so can you stay here in June? So he follow up and he says, you're gonna come. That's what do I got here? So she does some name dropping. I mean, from my perspective, it's name dropping because these are people I have not really met, and they're kind of giants in their fields. So she mentions C.B. Macpherson. C.B. Macpherson came up with the phrase possessive individualism. He was a giant in Marxist UK, in the Britain in the 20th century, Marxist historian. She mentions him and that she had talked with him and some other people. Henry Hornstein's teacher, The Making of the English, E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class. Henry Hornstein was a guest on our podcast. Even though he's a photographer, he'd study history with none other than E.P. Thompson. Well, these are people that were part of the, I guess what they'll call the New Left in England at that time, the 70s and 80s, and these are people, I guess, that she is discussing. Here's another passage here. Dear Sir Isaiah, again, 1986. Now I am, as you said, in the darkness. That's in quotes. I am in the darkness, and it has become again so hard to write. Forgive the terrible delay in writing this letter to you. I remember all the time my great stay in Oxford, our 4 meetings, and your extreme generosity that made me behave like a silly child. Now, there's a footnote here. Silly child. Why does she apologize for being like a silly child? And she says here in the footnote, at our very first meeting, Sir Isaiah greeted me with the English translation of the Polish article which I had sent him a couple of months before. So she wrote she's a student, and she wrote a political, essay or article, and Berlin actually translated it into English. Liked it so much, I went ahead, and she didn't know he was going to do that for her. And for all I know, he was sharing it with his colleagues, what she had written. And so she said she was so moved that she started crying when she met him. So that's just little, these are personal details, but they're, they're personal details, but I think they're significant because here we go. I'm sure you're wondering about the fall of communism in Berlin. Well, here we are, May 18th, 1990, Krakow. Here she goes. Dear Sir Isaiah, it has been such a long time since I last wrote to you. It has been partly because of rather vague prospects of publishing the book, which incidentally needs to be completed. So she says, I need to finish this damn thing, I'm writing this book. I have to finish it. Almost everything is going bankrupt. Almost everything is going bankrupt in Poland now. I have been told to be patient and wait. My publisher hasn't committed himself yet, as he can't even be sure about his own future. On the other hand, my daughters have contracted my sphere of negative liberty to almost nothing. That's a reference to the two liberties I don't want to get into. But I should not complain. You promised me 4 years ago the fall of communism. You said it must change because all things change. It's in quotes. And it has come true. We are all too tired to rejoice, but there is great relief and comparatively much hope. I myself found it all breathtaking, mostly the losing of my hump. So the hump was a Polish term. And I don't know who first coined it. I do know the Solidarity movement, Solidarność. They would use this word, and the hump was the term the Polish would use to describe the dictatorship there. They would say it's the hump. Mike Walesa would say it's kind of that's a kind of some history there, Polish history. The hump. At least that's what according to this. The losing of my hump. So the hump's lost, right? This is so interesting. She talks about advertising has come to our country. Advertising is quite a new phenomenon in Poland. So now we have ads. Its birth coincided with the rebirth of the free market. Once we watched on TV a very clever advertisement for a certain washing powder. She had never been interested in washing before, but from then on she started begging me to buy her just this brand. So she's saying that her 5.5-year-old daughter sees an ad for this detergent and says, "Mommy, I want that detergent." It's very unusual. Maybe it's just all children are different. I don't think I ever paid any mind to TV advertising for Tide, in the 70s and say, you got to get Tide. Maybe it's, I don't know. Maybe it's the fact that it's her daughter, not her son. I don't know, little girl. It's amazing. This detergent. I was reluctant as I thought it was a passing fad. It's interesting. She's an adult woman. She has these kids and she's a political philosopher. She's saying, why is this detergent so important? Just because, my daughter saw it on TV. But later, after a painful injection she had to have, I promised to do anything she wanted. She asked for the washing powder, and she was unimaginably happy. She hugged it, took it to bed with her, and was most grateful to me. Obviously, she wasn't going to use it. She is very self-conscious. She asked questions like, now these are Isaiah Berlin once says that all philosophers are like children. So philosophers basically don't leave childhood behind. They just, as adults, continue to ask the questions that children ask, like why is there something rather than nothing? Or what is time? Or does God exist? Or what is the future? What is the past? Or how ought we to live? I'm just coming up with these. Those are children's questions, Those are children's questions. They're not adult questions. I mean, adults can ask them, and of course, adults give sometimes, in my view, the best answers to those questions. But still, they start in childhood and they come from childhood. Going back to childhood, she asked questions like, how is it all possible that there is night? Again, what is nighttime? And after my long scientific explanation, she says, Mommy, I understand it now, but I don't believe it at all. Or do we really live or do we dream? That's another question a little girl is asking. Do we live? Do we really live or do we dream? She thinks we dream. So this philosopher's 5-year-old daughter tells her mom, and when going to bed at night, she says, I think that this is all a dream. That's just what she thinks in that moment. I asked her many questions. She really did not understand it all herself. She said, I have no idea what there is in my mind, but I terribly want this washing powder. I don't know. Washing powder, yeah. Tide. I don't know what is the question. It seems to me that the advertisement, while appealing to a deeper need, planted in her a substitute need of getting hold of the means. Maybe Charles Taylor is to a certain extent right. That's a reference to the philosopher Charles Taylor, which they both read and know. I enclosed a piece of mine just published in the Polish periodical. And that article, of course, is Two Visions of Liberty, Isaiah Berlin and Friedrich Hayek. And if you know your political philosophy, Friedrich von Hayek is the right-wing economist who's was extremely influential on the Tory party, on Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And this Polish philosopher used Isaiah Berlin as the foil, as sort of the foil or rival to Hayek. Two Visions of Liberty. Don't want to get into all of that now. It's not a political channel. I'm not a political philosophy channel. But I just thought that would be kind of interesting. Please send my kindest regards to your wife with warm affection. So this is just letter writing. These are just things. He does say something very interesting about advertising to Beata. He says, I have a debate with my friend Charles Taylor. And he tells Beata what he thinks. He said, your daughter seems to have an exceptional sensibility and imagination. About advertising, of course I would not deny that advertisements create desires, which were not there previously for things which in fact may not be good for one. So he concedes the point. Yeah, there's some advertising's not all good, right? But he disagrees with his colleague, Charles Taylor. He says, I don't like Charles Taylor. What I disagree with Charles Taylor about is that these artificially awakened desires are not real desires. All desires are stimulated by something. Whether the depths of one's own character or one's experience. Some unexpected physical, moral, emotional, or intellectual event in one's mind, heart, and soul. Of course, the causes are many and obscure and difficult to trace. What I do not think is that the desires stimulated, however dishonest and dangerous, are not real desires like all other desires. So what he's saying there is that there's a there, that we come, he's basically contradicting himself. Remember he said earlier there's no human nature? Well, he's now contradicting. He said, well, there's a human nature. We have natural desires. And so Berlin is slippery. He does contradict himself. I don't think that makes him a second-rate thinker. I just think he was uncertain about what human nature is and how much of it is natural, how much of it is artificial, how much of it is induced, how much of it is caused by society, how much of it is caused by our genes and this and et cetera, by the internet, by the web, by the FB, the YT, and so on and so forth, the screen. So that's what they talked about, he and his interlocutor here. I thought that would be interesting. I always have, when I do these episodes, I always have a little bit of uncertainty about how to proceed, because this series is a dense series, and it deals with many, many matters. It's not just France. It's not just Germany and Russia. It's not just the world today. It's not just Romanticism. It's political philosophy and many things. And so I thought I would conclude with kind of a teaser, a trailer for where we're going to go next. I got to dive into Herder and Hamann, or Hamann and Herder, these two Germans. But I want to go gently, not too deeply, because it's a big, complex issue. So, Berlin wrote this book about Hamann. He calls it The Magus of the North. J.G. Hamann. J.G. Hamann was a we could say he was a piece of work. Actually, this is interesting. Hamann's student, Herder, was the deeper, more profound thinker of the two. It's interesting. And between the two of them, the more conservative, the more reserved. It's not usually the case, right? Usually the teacher is the conservative one and the disciple is the one who gets more radical. But this is a reverse. This is a case where the teacher was more unhinged and wild, Hamann, and the student was a little more, we should say, mellow or chill, and the better writer. We're going to dive into both these thinkers. Not too much of them, but we got to do a little bit. So why? Because without Hamann and Herder, there would be no Romanticism. In fact, if Berlin is right in this book, Hamann is an influence on Nietzsche, on 20th century existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre. He's influential on the history of 20th century Christianity because he's a Protestant pietist, so we have to talk about pietism and Lutheranism, touch on a little bit, but just a little. How does Berlin introduce a thinker? I sort of think when you introduce a thinker, like I introduced in this episode, I introduced the great late Tom Stoppard who passed this month, one of the giants. As I said, he was one of the greats. He's with Pinter and Shakespeare. He's good. In spite of his, or maybe both in spite of and because of his Toryism, his conservatism. But just check out. We didn't mention his screenplays. Brazil. Jonathan Pryce, the movie Brazil. Wrote some other scripts too for amazing. Anyhow, but I introduced Stopper, but what does Berlin do when he introduces Hamann? Introduction. Who is this Hamann fellow? And he quotes Hamann twice in letters, of course. Back to see how important letters are in correspondence. Do either nothing or everything. The mediocre, the moderate is repellent to me. I prefer the extreme. And that's Hamann himself to his friend J.G. Lindener, 20th of May, 1756. So that gives you an idea of what Hamann was like if he says he only likes extremes. He doesn't like the mediocre and the moderate. Is that not the picture you have of Romanticism itself? Is that not a romantic statement? And underneath there's another quote from Hamann. Think less and live more. Think less and live more. That's Hamann to his student. See, he's chastising Herder. Herder, you're too measured, you're too chill, you're too mellow. Be like your teacher, be more intense. Hamann to J.G. Herder, 18th of May, 1765. Think less. So he's telling, think about this. This is a dude who, he's a theologian. He's teaching philosophy. He's teaching theology. He's teaching philology. You would think that a person teaching such things would say to their student, do more homework. Think more. He doesn't say that to Herder. He says to a student, get out in the sunshine. In other words, do less homework. Don't think so much. Get out. Go, I don't know. Go out and party. only a romantic would say that to his student. Not that that's anyhow. That's the stage for who kind of folks we're dealing with here. Anyway, he starts off the most passionate, consistent, extreme, and implacable enemy of the Enlightenment, and in particular all forms of rationalism of his time. He lived and died in the 18th century. Was Johann Georg Hamann. His influence, direct and indirect, upon the Romantic revolt against universalism and the scientific method in any guise was considerable and perhaps crucial. This may seem at first sight to be an absurd claim on the behalf of a man who is scarcely known in the English-speaking world, who is barely mentioned, at best, in some of our larger or more specialized encyclopedias as an esoteric writer, confused and obscure to the point of total unintelligibility, an eccentric and isolated figure about whose views, beyond the fact that he was consumed by some kind of highly individual Christianity, usually described as a form of pietism, believed in the occult truths of divine revelation, and a literal interpretation of the Bible. So this Hamann figure believes in a literal interpretation of the Bible. He's also a man who lived with a woman and didn't marry her and had some children by her. So, again, in Romanticism, we have figures that you can't pin down, you can't label them. They're conservative on Monday and liberal on Tuesday. They think, they're not tidy, stereotypical figures, That's what makes them romantics, I think. They don't. All right. He rejected the French atheism and materialism of his time and was at most a minor figure in the German literary movement known as Sturm und Drang. Sturm und Drang. Storm and stress. It's German. Sturm und Drang. These are the famous phrase of storm and stress. He goes on to talk, citizen of Königsberg. Hamann repays study. He is one of the few wholly original critics of modern times. Without any known debt to anyone else, he attacks the entire prevailing orthodoxy with weapons, some of which are obsolete, some ineffective and absurd, but there is enough force in them to hamper the enemy's advance, to attract allies to his own reactionary banner, and to begin, so far as anyone may be said to have done so, the secular resistance to the 18th century march of enlightenment and reason. The resistance which in time culminated in Romanticism, obscurantism, political reaction, in a great, deeply influential renewal of artistic forms, and in the end, in permanent damage to the social and political lives of men. Such a figure surely demands some degree of attention. Hamann is the pioneer of anti-rationalism in every sphere. Neither of his contemporaries, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Edmund Burke, can justly be called this. For Rousseau's explicitly political ideas are classical in their rationalism. Remember, Hamann is anti-rationalist. He's anti-science. Rousseau, for all Rousseau's criticism of sophistication and cultures we encountered in one of the previous episodes, believed in a rational, orderly whole. Rousseau did, and wrote about contracts. Hamann will have nothing, no contracts for Hamann, no plans, no rational order. While Edmund Burke appeals to the calm, good sense of reflective men. Remember my joke of Nietzsche? People don't believe in happiness, only the British believe in happiness. I think it's a famous joke. Well, Edmund Burke was English, and so, of course, as Berlin says here, he likes calm, good sense. All the while, of course, Burke denounces theories founded on abstractions. Hamann would have none of this. I don't want any of it. None of the above, Hamann says. None of the above. Wherever the hydra of reason, theory, generalization tears one of its many hideous heads, he strikes. He provided an arsenal from which more moderate romantics, Herder, even such cool heads as the young Goethe. So Goethe was influenced by Hamann. Herder, of course, was influenced by Hamann. Goethe, even Hegel, who wrote a long, not too friendly review of his work. So Hegel gave a sort of a mixed or bad review of Hamann. Even the level-headed Humboldt and his fellow liberals. Humboldt was one of the major figures in liberalism. So it's interesting. We're dealing with a matter of in a culture, in a country, just like Germany, Prussia. What do you call it? You have conservatives, you have liberals, you have secular people, you have, it's not, everybody doesn't think the same. Great diversity of opinion because you have a Humboldt, Humboldt is considered one of the founders of modern democratic liberalism. So, but even he liked Hamann. So this literalist Christian. Hamann is the forgotten source of a movement that in the end engulfed the whole of European culture. And then he goes on to give the dates, but anyhow, you've heard enough from me about Hamann. We're going to continue discussing in future episodes Hamann and Herder. And don't worry, we're going to get to art and culture. We're going to get to movies and TV shows and maybe some more plays. Tom Stoppard. I do hope you have a great weekend if you can, and I do sincerely hope that the holiday season is upon us and that you have a decent holiday season, Christmas, Hanukkah, whatever you worship or practice, Kwanzaa, all of it. Winter solstice for you nature folks, this is an important time in astronomy and botany, and it's a quiet time, and there's a lot of aspects to winter about which I can't get into too much detail here. Maybe future time we'll have a naturalist on to discuss the natural world in the winter, but we're in winter, and we're going to have a show at the end of the month. Well, we're going to have a really great show. So coming up, Morgan, a record store owner, is going to be on our podcast. That's in a week. I think it's the 18th. All about record stores. So that's a romantic thing to even have a record store. Vinyl. I love my episode with Morgan. That's coming up. And then at the end of the month, we're going to do another book lunch, and we're going to discuss the great Thomas Pynchon. I mentioned Tom Stoppard. Well, this is another giant of arts and letters. Thomas Pynchon has written a new novel. And me, my girlfriend Joanne, are going to join forces and talk about Shadow Ticket, the new Pynchon. That's a big topic. And so there's a lot coming up. And so thank you, and see you soon.